Okay, so as I was saying, this is our great pleasure to welcome Tim Lewens from Cambridge. Tim is a major philosopher of science and philosopher of biology, and he has worked on many different topics of interest to many of us, including cultural evolution, human nature, also many papers and a lot of work on evolutionary biology, of course. I can quickly mention why we disagree about human nature. That was in 2018. The Meaning of Science, which is a book of introduction to philosophy of science, a very good one, 2015. Cultural Evolution, Conceptual Challenges in 2015. Again in 2015, I don't know what happened that year, Tim, but that was just a crazy year for you. The Biological Foundations of Bioethics at Oxford, too. Also, his book on Darwin in 2007 is a great book. I've used it quite a lot in my lectures. It's really a great book. In 2004, a book on organism and artifacts at MIT Press. As you also know, Tim has worked on extended evolutionary synthesis, on mitochondrial donation, something he discussed some time ago here in Bordeaux. And also he was part of on the discussions, I should say, around the statistical interpretations of evolutionary theory. And he took some distance with regard to some of the claims of that debate, which I think was also something very interesting. Tim today suggested this topic, which we thought was great. Is there a direct role for values in the heart of the sciences? Tim, thank you very much for accepting our second invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay via Zoom. This is going to be a bit weird because here in Bordeaux, I'm in a room mainly full of master's students, and on Zoom, there are some unbelievably distinguished philosophers. So I'm probably going to flip-flop between talking as if I'm giving somewhat more introductory material to master's students, and then every now and then cowering in the wake of the fabulous expertise out there in the ether. Let me see if I can get my slides to go. Okay, there we go. So the first thing I should do is just say thank you. I want to thank everybody here in Bordeaux for inviting me. I've had 2 really enjoyable and productive stays here. I think the community here is an excellent one. I also want to thank some Cambridge colleagues who've really helped me out in my thinking about science and values. So former colleagues, former PhD students of mine, Azita Chelapu, Andrew Buskell, and Stan Connix, and also my continuing colleagues, Anna Alexandrova and Stephen John. They've been extremely helpful. So the question that I'm going to look at today is there a direct role for values in the internal phases of the sciences? And here is the basic gist of how I'm going to address this. Heather Douglas says a pretty clear no, and she said no several times in several publications. And I'm interested in seeing what the implications are of my colleague Anna Alexandrova's work on so-called mixed hypotheses and the extent to which they might cause some trouble for Douglas's position. So slightly less briefly in terms of a taster for what's going to happen today. The question asked by Douglas and by many people working on these issues about value freedom in the sciences is, what kind of role should values play in scientific work? And when I talk about values for the rest of this talk, I'm going to mean particularly social, prudential, ethical, and political values, the sorts of values that people have been most skeptical of vis-a-vis their legitimate role in the sciences, compared with what are sometimes called epistemic values, predictive accuracy, for example, or consistency. So when I say values, hence what I mean is things like social, ethical, political, prudential values. For reasons that I'll explain in a moment, Heather Douglas has said that although values play a legitimate role right through the sciences in all phases of scientific work, she nonetheless thinks that so long as we're talking about the internal phases of science, values cannot play a direct role. Their role has to be indirect. And she says that that's because giving values a direct role would be to endorse wishful thinking, which is pathological. Now, it seems to me that there are two suggestions that have been in currency for some time in philosophy of science, which, if true, at least prima facie, make trouble for Douglas when put together. One of these is that building a moral case for any claim, if it's a good moral case, doesn't usually involve wishful thinking anyway. That's not what moral deliberation looks like. And second, some scientific hypotheses, this is Alexandrova's claim, seem to involve what she calls mixed claims or mixed hypotheses. The scientific claims themselves simultaneously implicate factual and evaluative elements. Now, if you put those things together, you might think that you can have a perfectly good case for a scientific claim that itself brings disciplined ethical evaluation to the scientific hypothesis itself in a way that aims to give support to that hypothesis in a perfectly legitimate way. However, on inspection, although that seems like a good argument, it's quite hard to find clear-cut examples of this kind of reasoning in action. And I want to suggest a bit later on in the talk that there's an explanation for this, and it's because of a subtlety in the way that Alexandrova in particular understands what these mixed hypotheses are. And then towards the end of the talk, I'm going to try to give two slightly different suggestions, bringing all of this together for ways in which values really might play a legitimate direct role in internal phases of the sciences, albeit one that can be hidden from view, which is why it's not so easy to generate examples. But I will talk about some examples. First, I think sometimes scientists make scientific cases for the concepts that they're using, for the concepts that they will subsequently deploy in mixed hypotheses. And I think when that happens, there's a case for a direct role for value. Secondly, and somewhat more tentatively, I'll admit, I think sometimes scientists have empirical hunches, as I'm going to call it here, which have a preliminary evidential force, which might then be overridden later on as subsequent work occurs. And I think values can also play a role in motivating those empirical hunches. And I'll explain a lot more about what I mean by that later. Okay, so let's get into the talk proper. I'm going to accept, for the purposes of today, a distinction between internal and external phases of the sciences. Probably this could be challenged, but we're going to need something like this distinction to get the argument going, and it's certainly a distinction that Douglas relies on. So think of it roughly in this kind of way. Preliminary to actually conducting empirical investigation, scientists might ask various questions about what their research priorities ought to be, what topics are they going to get to work on, what kind of methods are ethically appropriate, are they going to use animals or not, are they going to use human subjects, are they going to subject those human subjects to onerous consent requirements, for example, should stakeholders be engaged in a way to design research that will maximize benefit for them. Think of those as external questions. One then moves into the internal phases of the sciences, where one looks at what the data are, how much evidence those data bestow on hypotheses. And then once the internal phases are done, one might then ask further questions, again in the external phases once more, about whether or how those results should be communicated, whether or how benefits perhaps from the research should be distributed. So Douglas, for one, uses this kind of distinction between internal and external phases. And maybe it's simplistic in some ways, but I think it'll hopefully do for today's purposes. Now, the inductive risk argument, which is what Douglas has become, I think, rightly famous for, is not going to be my focus today. Really, what I want to talk about today is the rest of the things that Douglas says. But not all of you will be familiar with the inductive risk argument, so I need to at least give you a flavor of what that argument is, but then I'm going to drop it and move on to talk about the rest of Douglas's work. So Douglas, in her very heavily cited philosophy of science paper in 2000, really aims to power up and resurrect Rudner's argument of 1953 against the ideal of value-free science. So one way of thinking about how the inductive risk argument works goes like this. A scientist can either accept P or accept not P. They have a choice. So perhaps the claim is something like this. A stretch of coastline will collapse and fall into the sea within the next 5 years. Either that's true or not. And the scientist can't be certain either of P or of not P. They might make a mistake. And different mistakes have different costs. So if they say that the piece of coastline will collapse when in fact it won't, then this might cost in terms of needless relocation. If they say that it won't collapse when in fact it will, this can also have cost in terms of needless loss of life. So Douglas's idea is that in choosing whether to accept or not accept P, and by that she means something like in choosing what apparent matter of fact to use as a basis for further action, the scientist has to take into account the costs of error. And the costs of error depend on the consequences of error, and they depend on the disvalue or value attached to those consequences. So that's the way in which ethical appraisal must, Douglas thinks, and should end up feeding back into the decision as to whether to accept or not accept a hypothesis. That's there in Rudner, I think. What Douglas is doing is she's arguing that these kinds of decisions about acceptance don't only affect, for example, choices to communicate results to external parties, choices to communicate to government, or choices to communicate to engineers in this kind of case. They also affect many other phases in the internal stages of science. For example, about characterizing data that will then be used for further inference within a research group. So that's roughly how the argument for inductive risk works. And it leads Douglas to make various claims about the proper roles for values in sciences. What she says is that although the inductive risk argument establishes a role for values in the internal phases of science, that role is, and at least if we're talking about the internal phases, should be indirect, according to Douglas. I think I'll say a little bit more about this in just a moment. I think what she means by indirect here is something like this. If you ask what hypothesis a scientist should accept, it partly depends on downstream costs of errors that might follow from accepting that hypothesis. So the role is indirect because those downstream costs are kind of feeding back on the decision to accept itself. She also is perfectly willing to admit that there's a direct role for values in the external phases of science. So most obviously, if one is trying to decide whether or not it's legitimate to use chimpanzees, for example, in a study, values can directly speak to the cogency of that choice. The way I see that, again, she's not always entirely clear on this, is that that role is direct because ethical and political considerations are forming part of the case for example, the urgency of research priorities, the propriety of using animals in research, and so on. But she says what you shouldn't have is a direct role for values in the internal phases of science. Let me try and suggest a little bit more about how she might want to draw this direct-indirect distinction. So some theorists, so Kevin Elliott's an example here. Elliott worried quite a long time ago in a nice paper that Douglas's direct-indirect distinction is very unclear. Here's a way that I hope is meant to be kind of true to what Douglas says about this distinction. It seems to me that the way she's thinking of it is something like this. Considerations play a direct role for some claim when they speak directly to its truth. Here they have an evidential role. And I think the best way to make sense of a lot of what Douglas says about the direct role for values in the external phases of science is that you might think that some evaluative claims have some kind of surrogate for truth, whether they're well-founded or not. So suppose the claim is it's legitimate to use chimpanzees in this study. You might think that claim is well-founded or not. Some considerations speak directly to supporting that claim. And when they do that, they're playing a direct role. So ethical claims can play direct roles sometimes, most obviously when they are supporting other ethical assertions, for example, about appropriate research methods. But there are other questions you can ask other than whether a claim is true or well supported. You can also ask, should the claim be relied on for action? Should it be asserted at all, maybe in a very, very sensitive context where people might react very adversely? Questions about the costs of error kick in here. It seems to me that there are also questions that aren't just about the costs of error, but that are about the effects of assertion, even if the claim is true, beyond all doubt, that might kick in as well. Just because you're certain of something doesn't necessarily mean you should tell everybody about it. So I think there are lots of ways in which indirect considerations might play a role too. So just to show you how I'm kind of thinking about this, take a claim like the building is infested with wasps. Considerations speak directly to the truth of this claim, maybe reports of stinging, sightings of nests, captured insects, but there might also be considerations that have an indirect bearing on it, rather than concerning its truth. Should it be communicated at all? Should it be relied upon for action? Maybe we're worried that by communicating it will cause panic. We might worry about costs of error in the standard ways in which the inductive risk argument works. Unnecessary spraying of insecticide, or potentially in the other direction, prolonging incidents of stinging if we don't do something about this. So here's Douglas in matrix form. She's got two important distinctions at work. She's got the internal-external distinction cutting against the direct-indirect distinction. She's clear that values have a legitimate direct role in the external phases of science. And as far as I can tell, what she means there is when we're engaged in ethical reasoning about what appropriate research methods might be, for example. She's also very clear via the inductive risk method via the inductive risk argument that in her view, values can play a legitimate indirect role in the internal phases of science. She only mentions this very, very briefly, but she does say in passing that values can play an indirect role in the external phases of science. I think that makes sense if, for example, you might worry that you've made a normative error. You might think that there are costs of normative errors as well. So you get something like the inductive risk argument going at that level too, although she says very little about this, but it seems to fit in with how she wants to understand things. But the one place where you get a big no thank you very much, sir, is a direct role for values in the internal phases of science. As she puts it, the proper role of values in the heart of doing science, sometimes she says the internal phases of science, has to be indirect. The integrity of science, she says, cannot tolerate a direct role for values throughout that process. That's from her 2009 book. Why not? What would be wrong with that? The answer she gives is it would endorse a kind of wishful thinking. You can sort of see why. If you just let people throw their values in this evidential supportive role, you might worry that this makes empirical hypotheses subject to the whimsy of whatever individuals might approve of or disapprove of. That's at least the way she seems to think about this. And she makes very similar comments, a very kind of understandable view, I think, in a number of places throughout her, since I'm in France, I'll use the word oeuvre. So she says, as Hempel rightly pointed out, value judgments have no direct place in the argument for what should be taken as true. A little bit more recently, values are not evidence, wishing does not make it so. And even more recently, from a 2016 paper, values in a direct role during evidential assessment would be equivalent to allowing wishful thinking into the heart of science. If values could play a direct role in the assessment of evidence, a preference for a particular outcome could act as a reason for that outcome or for the rejection of a disliked outcome. So she wants to keep the role of values under control, and she thinks this is the way to do it. So I've already hinted at this. Here are the two sources of worry which put together might make you think that there could be a legitimate direct role of values in the internal phase of science after all. Building an evaluative case, the way in which ethical reasoning is used to support a claim is not usually a matter of saying what one wants or what one wishes for. So even if you agree, and presumably most people will agree, that wishful thinking is not a good way of reasoning. And even if you therefore outlaw wishful thinking in the internal phases of science, that wouldn't necessarily outlaw a role for values, for evaluative deliberation, for evaluative case building in the internal phases of science. That's the first thought. But that won't get you anywhere by itself. But it might do coupled to the second thought. And the second thought is the value-ladenness of scientific hypotheses themselves, especially as proposed in the case that Anna Alexandrova has made recently-ish. Recently for me usually means before I became head of department. I kind of had a blip during that period. So in Anna's case for so-called mixed hypotheses. So putting these together, you might think that evaluative concerns can be part of a direct case. Evaluative concerns themselves form part of the supportive case. They are part of a direct role in that case for scientific claims that themselves implicate both factual and evaluative content. That's the conjecture, and that's what I want to investigate over the next several minutes. Okay, so the first claim, just give you an example of ethical reasoning in action from the kind of thing that I'm familiar with. So this is stepping back from the main topic of this talk. In the UK, a few years ago, a new technology was made legal, whereby women suffering from diseases of the mitochondrial genome can potentially have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren free of those diseases. And they do this by using donated eggs from individuals with healthy mitochondria, and then whipping out the nucleus from those donated eggs and putting another healthy nucleus from themselves in there. So now they've got healthy mitochondria. And for a long time in the UK, it's been the case that gamete donors, egg donors, cannot be anonymous to children born from gamete donation. But donors of eggs for the purposes of this mitochondrial therapy will stay anonymous. So the normal anonymity rule is waived in those kinds of cases. So this is a slide showing the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority's stance on this. So this is the law in the UK. And you might say, we think they've got that wrong. We think they've made an ethical mistake there. And you might try to make an ethical case, perhaps for insisting that donor anonymity be lifted in this context. And you would not make that ethical case by simply saying, I wish that mitochondrial donors were not anonymous. That's not how ethical reasoning works. This is something that's been stressed by Elizabeth Anderson, not using this particular example. Ethical reasoning has a kind of discipline to it. It doesn't normally look like wishful thinking, and it's wishful thinking to think it does. So you build a case by talking about what the nature is of mitochondrial donation itself compared with standard gamete donation. You might look at what reasons are given for upholding donor anonymity in the mainstream gamete donation case. You might try and look at some research on what the benefits are of mitochondrial donation, some of the reasons that people born from gamete donation give for wanting to know who their parents are. That's how it works. There's a discipline to this kind of case, and there can be better and worse ethical cases. So, as I've just said, this kind of wishful thinking, I wish it were P, therefore P, is almost always a bad mode of inference. Crediting values with a direct role in some domain of science needn't involve wishful thinking because of this form of discipline that goes along with it. By itself, this doesn't show that values can have a direct role in the internal phases of the sciences, because you also need to make some kind of case for why values would ever be relevant to supporting the kinds of claims that you see in the internal phases of science. So wishful thinking isn't ethical reasoning, but why ethical reasoning would play a role in the internal phases of sciences is as yet to be determined. But you get a strong steer that this might be reasonable if you look at Anna's work, my colleague Anna Alexandrova. So Anna claims that some sciences, at least, and she's mainly focused on the human sciences here, deal in what she calls mixed claims or mixed hypotheses. That is, they involve both factual and evaluative content. Hypothesis is mixed, she says, if and only if, and we'll come back to this definition a bit later, It's an empirical hypothesis about a putative causal or statistical relation. And two, this is the crucial part, at least one of the variables in this hypothesis is defined in a way that presupposes a moral, prudential, political, or aesthetic value judgment about the nature of this variable. Anna claims that many sciences, health sciences, she thinks, many human sciences, certainly the sciences of well-being, which is what she's been focused on in her research for some time, deal in these kind of mixed claims. She thinks they ought to deal in those kinds of mixed claims, and she doesn't think mixed claims should be eliminated. So put these two ideas together, and you get what looks like a prima facie case against Douglas. If scientific hypotheses have mixed content, then it looks like there really might be a legitimate role for evaluative reasoning in establishing those mixed hypotheses. After all, generally, ethical claims need evaluative reasoning in establishing them. So if some scientific hypotheses involve an ethical aspect, then it shouldn't be surprising if in the supported case, there's an ethical claim there itself. So this is one of the examples, this is the first example Anna gives in her paper of a so-called mixed hypothesis. Happiness is not always conducive to well-being. It comes from a piece of research from a scientist who works on well-being. This kind of claim, says Anna, involves a mixture of descriptive and evaluative elements. And that's because there's a choice over which conception of well-being is the right one to use, the most plausible one to use, and the choice of which conception of well-being to use is itself informed by, in this particular case, the goal of understanding which emotions are good for us and which might harm us. So you don't get an understanding of well-being at all without some kind of ethical input regarding what kind of states are harmful and what kind of states are good for us. There's a direct role for values then potentially in the internal basis of science, because the evidential support given to a claim like happiness is not always conducive to well-being doesn't draw solely on a piece of normative reasoning, but it does at least draw partly on a piece of normative reasoning about the right concept of well-being to use. That's Anna's claim. Okay. So that's the kind of prima facie case. And it turns out that it's actually quite hard to find examples of values being used in this direct role. So if the sciences really do regularly deal in mixed hypotheses, if these mixed hypotheses require, as you might then imagine, mixed support, should be lots of cases where scientists themselves contribute the form of ethical evaluative reasoning to the kind of case that they're building. But I don't think it is very easy to find those kinds of cases. Here's one reason, and I'll probably get to another one a bit later on. Depends how much time we have. One reason is that on inspection, I think it turns out that a hypothesis can be mixed in Anna's sense, in Alexandrova's sense, even when the role of values in making the case for it is actually indirect after all. So I promised Tom there'd be some case studies here, so I'll start easily looking at me urgently. This is a PINS talk, for heaven's sake. Those of you on Zoom can't see, but anxiety at times. Okay, so splitting elephants. Splitting the African the African elephant species into two. So scientific evidence had been mounting for a long time that the African elephant should probably be regarded as two separate species instead of just one. Finally, the IUCN, that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, agreed on recognition of two species in 2021. Reporting in The Guardian around about that time, alongside many other places, showed the beneficial consequences that can arise from these taxonomic decisions. So you see this Guardian story, which I just excerpted from here, Kathleen Gobush, an elephant specialist who led the assessors for the new classification, told the Guardian, going from vulnerable to endangered and critically endangered shows a much higher risk of extinction. It doesn't mean they'll go extinct tomorrow, but it's a higher risk. So one of the interesting things that's happening here is that by splitting the species, you've now got, instead of one species without very many members, you've now got two species with even fewer members, right? So you've gone to a more endangered status, which allows potentially more resources and more attention to come in. But she also says, this reclassification allows dedicated attention to each animal, the forest elephant and the savanna elephant, and then to tailor conservation plans according to each species' needs, which are different. So one of the effects of splitting is more research attention is paid, particularly to the forest elephant, which I think had been regarded as neglected in terms of research efforts up till then. So it's uncontroversial that decisions about species delimitation can have these kinds of potentially beneficial and or negative effects. What's more contentious is the question of whether or not those effects should be taken into account when the decisions about species status are being taken on in the first place. And there's a suggestion that maybe they should, that comes from the perspective that's sometimes called the ontic risk perspective, as opposed to the inductive risk perspective. So David Ludwig in particular, but he's certainly not the only person to have suggested this. You get similar ideas coming from my former student, Stan Conix, also from another former student of mine, Andrew Buskell. And in a way, a lot of this work also has very strong resonances with much older work from people like, well, most obviously John Dupre as well. The idea goes something like this. Nature doesn't sort of stand up and tell us all by itself what the right way to draw a taxonomy is. Scientists have choices over precisely how they demarcate kinds. And it is legitimate, people like Ludwig will say, to make the choice over precisely how you want to demarcate kinds, partly by looking at what the choices, what the consequence of those choices will be for various practical projects. Now, note, this has some similarities with the inductive risk argument, but I don't think it's the same. The inductive risk argument is all about making a fallible inductive step. It's all about not having enough data to be sure of a particular conclusion and thereby needing to factor in the consequences of error. What these ontic risk arguments instead are alluding to, particularly in the case of species concepts, is that even if you knew everything, even if you had a perfect command of all of the biological events going on across a stretch of time, you would still have a choice over precisely how to fashion your species concepts so as to demarcate either one or two or multiple species. The facts by themselves won't tell you, even if you knew all of them, precisely what form of taxonomy you should use, whether you should use a more lumping taxonomy or a more splitting taxonomy. And it's partly because of those kinds of considerations that you see real life biologists sometimes evaluating what the consequences will be of different forms of classification, in particular, sometimes different species concepts, and using those to favor one type of species approach over another. So you get this in this interesting paper by Frankham et al. From 2012, and this I'm following very closely in Stan Conix's footsteps here in his really nice 2019 paper on this. So back in 2012, Frankham et al. In this paper in Biological Conservation just explicitly set themselves a task of deciding which approach to species delimitation is going to be the best one for conservation approaches. They say, you can see here, we evaluate methods for defining species from the perspective of conservation biology, advocating that definitions used in conservation biology should maximize conservation benefits, pick the species definition that has the best effects down the line. I'll say a bit more about precisely how they make that case in just a moment. Now, this ontic risk stance seems like the inductive risk approach, best understood as an indirect role for values. It's not about the costs of error. But on the other hand, these ontic risk claims are not about evidence for a hypothesis. Instead, they're about which version of a hypothesis is the better one to test, based on an assessment of which approach to taxonomy would have the best downstream consequences. So now suppose you consider a claim like African savanna and forest elephant should be considered two different species. On the ontic risk approach, the answer that you give to that is partly going to depend on which species concept you choose, and the species concept you choose can indeed depend legitimately on what the downstream consequences will be of those kinds of choices. But now compare that with precisely how Alexandrova defines mixed hypotheses. At least one of the variables in this hypothesis, she says, is defined in a way that presupposes a moral prudential, political, or aesthetic value judgment about the nature of this variable. Now, what this means is that the claim about elephant species can turn out to be mixed because the choice over how to define species is affected by reflection on the consequences of definition one way or another, even if there's no suspicion at all that the content of the claim itself, the precise terms in which the definition is stated, carry evaluative content. What that shows for aficionados in this area is that mixed hypotheses in Alexandrova's sense are not the same as thick moral claims in, for example, Bernard Williams's sense. So for that reason, it doesn't actually follow that mixed claims need to have evaluative support, because mixed claims themselves needn't have evaluative content. Instead, a decision over how to define the terms, which might have no evaluative content themselves, is dictated by an eye on downstream consequences. So that is potentially one reason why you don't see direct roles for value springing up all the time, even if Alexandrova was right about mixed claims. But here's a suggestion. Evaluation might get back into the mix again if we shift back. So what I've said is that values might have an indirect role when it comes to assessing mixed claims. Indirect because the values themselves don't act as an evidential base for the mixed claim. They instead help us to decide which concepts we should want to use in that claim in the first place to create a hypothesis that will be more or less fruitful in terms of evaluation for science. But then it sounds as though evaluative claims really might have a direct role in making the case for fixing the meanings of the terms themselves. And it seems to me that those kinds of questions can indeed be central to internal inferences of some sciences. So think about how Frankham et al. Make their case. They are worried about the so-called diagnostic phylogenetic species concept. So they basically say, look, there are two worries here. If we're thinking about small populations, you might be worried about inbreeding depression if the population is very small and all the individuals start mating with each other. You might also worry about outbreeding depression if hybridization occurs with a more distantly related population. I'm trying not to use the species word here yet, because that kind of comes in further down the line. Outbreeding depression occurs, roughly speaking, when you've got individuals adapted to two different environments, and the hybrid kind of falls between two stools and is adapted to nothing at all. And so what they say is this: look, if your species concept involves too much splitting, then it can lead to very, very narrowly defined species, very narrowly defined indeed, which can be subject to inbreeding depression. If your species concept leads to a lot of lumping, then instead the species will end up being very, very broadly defined. And in a conservation context, that can lead to outbreeding depression, because it might turn out that any individual within the species is viewed as fair game to be mated with any other individual. And they worry that human population growth leads to this kind of fragmentation. Small populations can be threatened by small size, also by inbreeding depression, and they might be affected by evolutionary processes in very idiosyncratic ways. So a small population, just through drift, can accumulate a bunch of differences, leading to diagnosability according to the diagnostic phylogenetic species. So they give us this diagram. So you're supposed to be focusing here, I think, on the one in the middle. I think, can you see my pointer here? And so A4 here is supposed to be a kind of very, very small endangered population. Here are a bunch of other healthier, larger populations, very, very, very permissive, very, very lumping species definition leads to all of these populations being included in the same great big species. This makes A4 vulnerable to outbreeding depression because of crosses with populations B1 and B2. Very, very, very splitting definitions might lead to A4 being considered as a species in its own right. That, they think, leads to other kinds of worries because of inbreeding depression, and also because of no prospect for so-called genetic rescue, because none of these individuals are going to be thought as kind of fair game for mating with these individuals. And so instead, we want some kind of happy medium here, where we've got, so to speak, the better species delineation in terms of the right balance between lumping and splitting. And they worry that the diagnostic phylogenetic species concept will tend to lead to this kind of scenario. And they think that something more like a biological species concept will tend to lead to this kind of scenario, which they regard as the better one. And so what's going on here is that their argument for these concepts is a value-driven, because it's based on the important role of these conservation efforts. But it's not a dogmatic one, and it's potentially sensitive to alteration by new data or different interpretations of the data. So this looks like a case where if you step back and ask the question, which is the better species concept to use in the first place, they're not doing this based on wishful thinking. They're not saying, oh, I don't know, we'd like it if the biological species concept were better. They're building a disciplined case here, but this really does look like a mixed case to me. It's a case that involves serious attention both to empirical data and also to normative reasoning about the desirability of conservation efforts. I could stop the talk there, or I can carry on. I can't remember when I started, Thomas.
Well, you started at 5. You still have 15 minutes. It works for you.
Yeah, no, I can do an extra bit in that case. Okay, let's do the tentative bit then. And this uses some work that I talked about when I was here last time about manioc processing. So sorry about that. For those of you who are here, you're all sick of manioc. But, I'll try and do it quickly. What I've been assuming up until now is that mixed hypotheses are the only kinds of hypotheses that are likely to get direct support from values. I don't think that's quite right. Plausibly non-mixed hypotheses might sometimes get direct support from values too. So here's a kind of a toy example, and then I'll try and suggest that this may have some relevance to scientific reasoning as well. So here's the silly toy example. Here's a non-mixed claim. Benedict probably didn't swear at his colleague. Here's some mixed evidence that you might bring to bear in support of that claim. Swearing at one's colleagues shows a lack of due respect. I take it that that's a normative claim because it's about due respect. And Benedict always shows his colleagues due respect. Right? You might think put together those two things mean that you're a bit skeptical about whether or not Benedict really swore at his colleague. Now, of course, the evidence that one gives there is certainly not decisive, but evidence is never decisive. This evidence might be reevaluated, witnesses might come forward, you might realize Benedict was suffering a lot of stress for some reason or another, and so the normal treatment that he gives to his colleagues may have slipped. But I think this does carry some evidential import. It's a kind of hunch, if you like. It's a kind of evidentially motivated hunch with some preliminary force. And when I say preliminary force here, I mean it's the sort of thing that really does support a case that Benedict probably didn't swear at his colleague, but which might be overridden as you investigate further. Now, you might reply, isn't the evaluative aspect redundant here? I don't know. But it seems to me that what you need to show is not that it's redundant, but that this is an illegitimate role for evidence. Even if it's redundant, it might still be legitimate to bring this evidence to bear. You might think it's redundant because you might think you can give a non-mixed version of exactly the same case. Swearing at one's colleagues is considered inappropriate according to local norms, right? Maybe that's not a normative claim, it's just a sociological claim. And Benedict always conforms to local norms. I'm willing to concede that. I don't think it necessarily shows that mixed evidence lacks cogency, even if the same evidence could have been presented in a different way. Okay, manioc. So those of you who are here know this already. So Joe Henrich, in his 2016 book, The Secret of Fast Success, points out this fascinating case of Tucanoan people of Amazonia who've learned to process poisonous manioc into healthy bread called casabe by what Henrich calls a dumb process of imitation of others in their community. And he thinks this underpins a hidden hand explanation for the emergence of a remarkably effective processing regime. And he thinks this shows cultural selection to be very closely analogous to blind natural selection. It really is very impressive what Tucanoan folk do. There are lots of different kinds of manioc, varying in how deadly they are. And the type of manioc that Tucanoan people prefer has particularly high levels of cyanogens in its roots, even by the standards of so-called bitter varieties. But there's very little evidence that they suffer from any kind of health problems linked to cyanide poisoning, according to fieldwork done by Dana Dufour, who you can see here. The processing regime is elaborate. They dig tubers from the ground, they remove the outermost layers of peel, they wash and grate the roots, making a kind of watery mash. That mash is then washed, squeezed in a strainer. That removes the fiber from the starch and liquids. Starch is allowed to settle from the washing water. The washing water is then boiled to make a drink called maniquera. But the starch and fiber are stored at least overnight, but ideally for 48 hours. This is the important phase for our purposes today, this storage phase, where apparently nothing happens other than storage. And then after 48 hours, they're recombined and baked to produce casabe. Now, it turns out this waiting process, this 48-hour waiting process, is really helpful in terms of reducing cyanogen content. So what this diagram from Dufour's work is showing is that if you bake your casabe straight away without that waiting process, there's still 7.6% of the original cyanide in the mixture. After one day, after a 24-hour wait, that drops to 7.4%, so it's still pretty high. But after a 48-hour wait, it drops to 3.2%. So it's a really good idea to wait. Now, here's what Henrich says. 7.6%, right, when it's kind of up here, that's bad for you. But it's not high enough that it'll provoke any kind of acute illness. Instead, it's only going to provoke kind of slow burn illnesses, chronic illnesses that accumulate gradually over time, such as goiter. Henrich also says there's no discernible decline in bitterness across this period. So how on earth does anybody know that this 48-hour waiting period has any beneficial effect at all? Henrich reasons along the following lines. An intelligent agent would most likely think, I can just skip, why don't I skip this waiting phase and enjoy my casabe faster? Henrich says that would be a mistake. It's one cultural evolution avoids, and it's good that it does that. And it does it just through dumb imitation. So this stress on the dumbness of imitation is important for Henrich, because in his view, it's what allows the cultural inheritance process to work a lot like natural selection. And natural selection is very good at accumulating really impressive adaptations without plants themselves, for example, needing to understand them or know anything about them at all. So by stressing the dumbness of the imitation, Henrich thinks he can assimilate adaptation, i.e. the accumulation of this remarkably efficacious processing regime, to something like natural selection, quite a kind of cultural version of natural selection. Now, back to some new stuff that those of you who were here a few weeks ago didn't hear. These kinds of explanations fact, the whole field of cultural evolutionary theory elicits highly moralized reactions sometimes from commentators, often particularly from commentators in social anthropology, who find the style of explanation put forward by people like Henrik kind of morally outrageous. So the photo is of Tim Ingold. Ingold, back in 2007, says, these explanations are, and he means all cultural evolutionary explanations here. He says, these explanations are an affront to millions of intelligent human beings for whom traditions are real and important, but who are not on that account trait-bearing cultural clones whose only role in life is to express in their behavior, artifacts, and organizations information that's been transmitted to them from previous generations. Azita Chelapu notes Ingold's reaction there, and she kind of tries to nuance it in various ways, but she suggests that the cultural evolutionary approach in some cases gives rise to significant harm through depriving individuals of agency through various forms of othering and consequent dehumanization. Now, Chelapu is particularly interested in whether or not cultural evolutionary theory does harm to indigenous peoples. All I want to do today is look at whether or not these kinds of moralized reactions could instead just have some epistemic effects. Is there any way in which you might use moralized reactions as part of a direct case, evidential case against the sort of thing Henrik says about manioc processing among Takanoan people? And I think Ingold overstates things in the way that he goes into attack mode here. But I think if you focus not at such a broad level of generality, but at a more specific case, then there might be something in this kind of approach. So think about it this kind of way. Think about the case of Benedict, first of all. So Benedict, remember, we're skeptical. I'm skeptical. Benedict's an imaginary person, but let's imagine that I'm skeptical about whether Benedict really did swear at his colleagues. And what's going on in this case is that my observations of Benedict's behavior have given some inductive support to a claim that is admittedly ethically loaded, namely that Benedict has a respectful, maybe courteous character. And that in turn grounds a hunch, gives some evidential support to a hunch I have that empirical claims about particular forms of behavior attributed to him may well be false. I'm skeptical that he really swore at his colleague. And then I might go out and try and find some further evidence confirming or undermining that claim. I might get a bit more serious about my evidential basis and start interviewing people, for example. Channeling Chelapu, here's what you might do in the Takanoan case. You might think observation gives some inductive support to another ethically loaded claim. Something like this. Western researchers have tended repeatedly to demean indigenous peoples. That in turn might give you a hunch with what I'm thinking of here as preliminary evidential thoughts, that empirical claims about specific forms of behavior attributed to them may be false. Is it really so clear that they imitate other people in this dumb way? Shouldn't we credit them with more agency? And that's just a preliminary hunch, but it seems to me it has some evidential force. And so what one should then do is not just take the evidential cases open and shut there, but see whether that hunch can be confirmed or undermined as additional evidence is gathered. And it seems to me that when you look at the further evidence here, it does support some central elements of Henrik's story about cultural accumulation, about gradual cultural accumulation, giving rise to this incredibly impressive suite of detoxifying techniques. But looking at further evidence also does give stress to forms of agency and undermines the aspects of dumb imitation that he claims. So, for example, when you then look to gather additional evidence, what you find is that Tucker and Owen people have a pretty good grip on what the effect is of the 48-hour waiting phase. It gives rise to a so-called sourdough taste they like. It gives rise to a more open bread-like texture. And those of you who were here a couple of weeks ago know about this stuff as well. Tucker and Owen women don't imitate in a dumb way. They have chances to taste each other's bread at communal meals, and in that way straightforwardly gain information from each other about different techniques being used. Tucker and Owen women also, it seems, based on some of Dufour's field notes, do actually have access to some forms of imitation about the detoxifying effects of fermentation. And fermentation is what happens during that waiting phase, which is something you don't get from Henrik's story. Because they appear to know, or some of them at least seem to know, that if you were to feed fresh mash that hasn't waited, to their chickens would get sick. So you get a richer story, and you get a story that supports the initial hunch about the importance of attributing agents. Okay, so this is it now. Closing thoughts. So suppose a scientist is trying to decide whether my hypothesis is true. Suppose they're trying to think, what do I have in terms of support for that case? What makes a direct contribution to that case? What I've suggested is that there are two legitimate roles for invoking evaluative concerns. They can invoke evaluative concerns when the question they're asking themselves in the first place is, what are the right concepts that we should be using in our hypotheses? That was the lesson of the conservation biology. And they can also use evaluative concepts in determining some of their preliminary reactions to the supposed truth of a hypothesis. These look to me like direct roles for values. In the first one, the direct role is to make a case for using one set of concepts over another. In the second case, the direct role is this preliminary evidential support. It also seems to me that these values lie within the internal stages of science, at least if what we mean by that is that they involve the type of evidential case that stands in support of a scientific claim. They're not just about which topics might one want to decide to research in the first place. They're not just about which methods are ethically appropriate, for example. But I think their role is probably hard to detect, and that's why these examples don't spring up all over the place. Hard to detect, not because they are indirect or external, but because within the internal phases, they play a distal role. The role for values may sometimes ossify. So it's a distal role in the sense that it's often there in the background, telling the scientist which concepts they should be using in the first place. And that may ossify over time. Once scientists settle on a certain set of concepts in conservation biology, for example, you wouldn't expect the background ethical case to keep rearing its head every time they publish a paper. And because I've suggested in the second kind of role, the preliminary reaction, the hunch, the evidential hunch role, you would normally want to then gather a lot of subsequent evidence. The kind of role for values is likely to become overridden later on, and certainly may not appear in published papers, for example. So that's why, even if these roles are direct, they may often be hard to detect. I'll just leave you with some key references that were useful to me in this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, William.
Shall I stop sharing the screen? Or should I carry on sharing the screen? What's best?
It depends on, yeah, maybe you can, I think maybe you can keep the situation this way, and we'll see if you need some of the slides to answer the questions. So I think we should give priority to people in this room. If anyone has a question, or maybe you prefer to wait. I see one question on Zoom by Andreas Buchardi.
And Stefan has a question. Oh, sorry.
Yes. So should I start, or is there someone in the room first?
You can start.
Okay, thank you for your talk. Extremely interesting. So just a few comments. So the idea of values in science goes back to Max Weber, Wert-Urteilsstreit. And then, I mean, since that time, it has been generated a lot of controversy, especially Helen Longino with the contextual empirism and so forth. And the problem is, to me, the whole concept of values, because values, you have moralization, politicization, ideology. That's one thing. And now when you shift the values from the pure epistemic values, because if you do science, you have epistemic values. You say, okay, when I do science, I think it's good to do science and to know things about the world. This is let's say it's the fundamental value that, in fact, every scientist should have. But the problem is when you introduce too much of the social part, that means, and you exaggerate the social part, you do moralization up to ideology, then you are in a slippery terrain. Slippery terrain because we have seen what happens when you go down this route. So that's one. So one comment that I would make. Of course, we can discuss Helen Longino and so forth with the contextual empirism and the distinguishing between external, internal. In fact, the internal are to me the epistemic values mainly. So if I'm right. So this is the first comment that I would make. And the second is Joe Henrich. I mean, Joe Henrich, I mean, so I had invited him here, so he was a guest, and his science is based on data. I mean, he's doing a lot of data-driven field research, and is an extremely brilliant scientist. So I don't know if these critics about his approach, especially he was also working about the weird stuff where he relativized all the anthropological research or psychological.
Oh, you're frozen, I think.
Research that has been done in West of societies. This is wrong. But of course, he applies the scientific approach and the method. That means data, data, data. So I don't know how, in this respect, he can be attacked on that ground. Because if you go for data, then of course your science has some consequences how you see it. But I mean, endogenous, what you know. So in terms of folk knowledge, stuff like this is not science. It may be close to some of the science, but it's not science. So I would like to know your point of view on this type of criticisms and comments.
Yeah, okay. Why don't I take that last point first? So I at the risk of, I try not to repeat myself too much. Yeah, I mean, of course, Henrik gathers data. On the issue of the specific case I was talking about, I think there really are problems for Henrik's take on what's going on with manioc processing among Tucanoan people. And of course, the way to answer that is by giving more data. And it looks to me as though there really are bits of evidence that undermine the particular story that he wants to tell about how manioc processing emerges among Tucanoan people. So I wasn't making that stuff up. The information about the kinds of the communal meals, the information about the importance of the sourdough taste, that wasn't a kind of intuition on my part. That's taken from looking at Dufour's fieldwork. And Henrik's own case is based on Dufour's fieldwork. I think there's more in Dufour's fieldwork than he acknowledges. And I also think, for what it's worth, that some of the ways in which Henrik mobilizes data on so-called over-imitation, for example, and also some of the ways in which he mobilizes data on so-called prestige bias, are not as solid as he might think. So that is based on bringing data against Henrik's hypothesis. So that's why I said that I thought Ingold was over-exaggerating. But that is also why I tried to say, what happens if we take these worries about agency that come from his critics and use them to generate what I call preliminary evidential hunches, which I don't think seal the case against Henrik by themselves at all, and then use those as a prompt to search for even more evidence, right? And it seems to me that when we do things in that way, the evidence does indeed appear, and some of what Henrik wants to say is undermined. So I don't think that, I certainly don't think that the case against Henrik goes, Ingold says it's an outrage that people are being treated as cultural clones, ergo Henrik is wrong, right? I mean, that would be a terrible inference. And that's actually one of the reasons why why I think Ingold exaggerates awfully at certain points, right? I mean, I think that there are various things that Ingold says when he goes into attack mode that don't hold water at all. On the first part, I think you mentioned that there are lots and lots of other people who've worked on these topics. I mean, absolutely, there are. So yeah, Weber, Longino, there are other people that I could have talked about but didn't. Sharon Clough, for example, has done really good work in these areas. Yeah, there are lots of very, very important people whose work I didn't talk about. I was trying to look kind of pretty head on at this issue about whether the internal phases should only involve non-evaluative claims establishing the facts. And I was trying to push against that in two ways. So one was whether the claims that are established in the internal phases are all purely factual. And the other one was about whether or not there can be some evidential probity that comes from evaluative claims. So I guess I was disagreeing with. I mean, you're right that if what you said was correct, then I'm wrong. But I hope that I'm right.
Thanks, Tim. There's a question from Steven, then from Steven, and then from Steve.
Yeah. Okay, so also following on the Maniok example, I was wondering if that case couldn't be reconstructed. So this is not an objection, but just a question to clarify. As a case where someone like Henrik himself violates the value-free ideal of science by bringing in certain biases, and that the way values come in is thus in a kind of correcting role, like removing bias to restore, in a sense, a value-free ideal.
That's okay. Make sense? Yeah, that makes sense. That's really so. Okay, so for those of you who could everybody, I don't know if everybody could hear that. Maybe everybody could because you've got quite a microphone. So could I recast the Henrik case as one where? So your idea was Henrik himself is using values in a problematic way, or that
his research is biased in the sense that he selects evidence maybe in a certain way that supports his particular way of seeing things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a way of doing it. I mean, that is the way that I think a lot of work in the sort of Lisa Lloyd kind of tradition of doing feminist philosophy of science has worked, for example. her work on female orgasm, for example, is very much in this tradition of saying too much work on orgasm or too much work on sexual behavior among primates was undertaken in a way that imported various male biases, and strip those out and you get a much fuller picture, because data which are invisible to anybody with those kinds of biases, often because they just don't look for it in the first place, suddenly comes into view. I think there might be a way of telling that story here. I mean, I didn't want to tell that story here because the problem with telling that story is if that's true, then it doesn't show a direct role for values in the internal phases in quite the same kind of way. So if that way of telling the story is true, what you get is something. So I don't think Lisa Lloyd's version, for example, shows you that there's a direct role for values in the internal phases, because it's not really that the feminist values, in her view, are showing you what the true hypothesis is. The feminist values are making it plausible that certain kinds of data have not been looked at properly. And then you gather the data, and then it's the data that speaks to the hypothesis. I mean, really, that was just my. So my talk isn't very. If that's the right way to think about this, then I haven't got anything very interesting to say, which might be okay. I think I was trying to find a way in which, I mean, it seems to me that in some of these cases, I mean, the way that Anderson, for example, talks about this sometimes is it makes, so she sometimes seems very resistant to the idea that feminist values, for example, act in an evidentiary role. She sort of writes more as if the feminist values sort of tell you what containers you might need to then place data in. And sometimes you don't have the right set of containers, so you'll never be able to get the data into them. I guess it just seems to me that there is room for this sort of evidentiary hunch kind of argument that I'm talking about, right? Where you really do think that there's maybe a very mild, but nonetheless a sort of prima facie evidential case, simply based on the inductive track record, right? It probably doesn't work out like that because ... It probably doesn't work out like that because there's a tradition of failing to attribute enough agency to indigenous peoples. And probably if we did attribute more agency, we'd realize there was something wrong with that hypothesis. It seems to me that that's evidence, it seems to me. It's not much evidence. It's quite weak evidence. And you certainly have to do a lot more work later on. But I think that's a kind of evidence. So it's not quite the sort of finding the right containers role. I think maybe what you could do, funnily enough, is you could revisit Lloyd's work and try and tell her story a bit more like that.
The next question comes from Stephen Lindquist.
Hi, Tim. Thanks in particular for the clarification on the direct and indirect distinction. I found your analysis interesting. I guess, though, I'm still a little fuzzy on the internal-external distinction. And the way I've conceptualized it is maybe a bit simplistic. If you're formulating a hypothesis and asking yourself, is this a hypothesis that we should pursue? It's an external question. Okay, so maybe that's overly simplistic. But if we were to run with that, so it seemed that some of the work, Heinrich's in particular, it seemed that we were now evaluating what hypothesis should we be asking here? How should we formulate it? And little less clear in the conservation case. But I just wanted to push you a bit on that and suggest that your examples are maybe more towards the external side of the process than the internal side.
Yeah, I'm worried about that as well. I've kind of put my hands up there. So let me try and say a few things about this. First of all, I mean, the first thing is, yeah, you might be right. It might be that what I'm really doing is I'm finding more external phases. If that's true, they're not the kinds of external phases that have been stressed, I don't think. So the way I read Douglas, for example, external questions are something like, shall we work on eliminating obesity or shall we work on eliminating malaria, right? Or external questions are something like, shall we use rats in our study or shall we use a computer model, right? Something like that. Very, very kind of preliminary to any, so to speak, real research efforts, right? So they might be about which of these questions is the more urgent or something. And the reason, and whereas what I'm talking about, I mean, even if they are external, they're not the same kind of external questions. And a reason for thinking that they might, a reason for thinking that they might not be external, I mean, in the conservation case, for example, the move that I tried to make on the direct-indirect distinction might be repeated for the internal-external distinction. So I'm imagining some in the direct-indirect case, I'm imagining somebody saying, is the African elephant one species or sorry, is the African elephant one species or two? Or, you know, forest elephants and savanna elephants are two distinct species. Suppose that's the claim. I was suggesting something like, look, you might say the role for values in that claim is indirect because the values don't tell you whether that claim is true. They tell you in an indirect way how you ought to formulate that claim in the first place. But suppose the claim is not African and savanna elephants are two distinct species. Suppose the claim is instead the biological species concept is the best one to use for conservation biology, right? Suppose that's the claim. That really is a claim that scientists care about and they bring evidence to and they write papers about and they do research on. And it seems to me it's a claim that they address partly using normative considerations as well as empirical considerations. And so similarly, you might say, look, you could say that that's external to science because you've got to get your concepts lined up first of all before you go and do the research. But there's also a straightforward scientific question to go, which concepts do we want to use? And you can set a research team to work on that issue as well, right? And at that stage, it seems to me that it kind of becomes internal because it is itself the focus of the research. So that Frankham et al. Paper just is a paper that asks that question. And it would be a bit strange to say what they're doing is all external work. And that seems a bit odd to me. And in the Henrik case, yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, something else that I was thinking about myself as I was walking around Bordeaux yesterday on exactly this issue was that in some ways, this whole internal-external thing, ooh, why did that happen? Did everybody see balloons coming up in front of my face?
Yeah, I did.
Because you moved your hand.
I moved
it again.
Very odd.
It does also weird things.
Sorry, everyone. So the other thing I was thinking, I'm trying to repeat myself, and I'm just going to get in the doom loop of balloons. I think this internal-external distinction is itself one way in which the internal-external distinction is itself a bit simplistic, is because what it's doing is it's assuming that there's a bunch of preliminary questions you ask about, so to speak, setting up what we're going to work on and how we're going to do it. And then you do the research, and that's when all the evidence gets gathered. But of course, even when you're thinking, what are we going to research on? You're bound to be guided in some way by what the evidence tells you might be the more fruitful direction. And particularly in the Henrik case, everybody brings prior evidence to bear in generating maybe some very prima facie hunches about what they think the truth is going to be with regard to a hypothesis, sort of before they start doing the serious research. So are the internal questions the ones about when the research project is kind of formally underway, or are the internal questions the questions about what's the level of support given to a question? And it seems to me that certainly if we take it in the second kind of way, there might be loads of very, very internal questions that involve all sorts of quite idiosyncratic uses of little bits of information that dropped into your lap from here and there that are nonetheless relevant to your preliminary assessment of a hypothesis. Internal or external, I think probably what that shows is that the very idea of demarcating strict internal external phases is overly simplistic.
Thank you. That's good.
Thank you.
For those who don't know, Steve, who just asked the question, is one of our next speakers in the seminar. The final question will be by Steve here, master student in Bordeaux.
A lot of pressure. So I gathered that the Manioc case was intended to be a case study for how it can be epistemically beneficial to incorporate values internal to the scientific process. And it seems to me like there are many examples one could imagine where it would be epistemically vicious, or there might be a deleterious payoff to incorporating values internal to the process of science. And I don't just mean have morally vicious consequences, I mean have epistemically vicious consequences. Yeah. And so what criteria might there be that could help one in advance identify whether the values that they're using are going to be epistemically beneficial or harmful?
Yeah, good question. So I think what I want to do is fall back on my silly kind of toy philosopher's example to give some clues about this, right? So my silly toy philosopher's example was about Benedict, where it seems to me that it is not pathological for me to say, probably Benedict didn't swear at his colleague. Why do I think that? Because swearing at your colleague's not a respectful thing to do, and Benedict always acts in a respectful way. I don't think that's a pathological way of reasoning. I think that's absolutely fine. What would make it pathological? One thing that would make it pathological would be it's not the value ladenness. This is a point Anderson makes a lot. It's not the value ladenness. It would be dogmatism, right? Suppose I said, and I'm just going to shut my ears to anybody who wants to tell me that Benedict really did swear, because I'm so convinced that that would clearly be wrong. Okay, and actually, so I might reassess my views about Benedict's character. To be honest, I might also reassess my views about whether it's respectful to swear at people as well, right? Somebody might say to me, you've not really understood. We've got this culture where certain words and certain kind of concepts, they're just absolutely fine, and you're just being a bit prissy about the whole thing, right? So flexibility in the face of evidence, including normative evidence, is important here. I mean, obviously, one of the other things that's important is that I have paid attention to the track record, right? The only reason why this gets going in the first place is that the track record itself is reliable, right? So I've got to have actually observed what Benedict's up to and come to a reasonable conclusion about him. And that's not going to happen in cases where I just become, I think he's called Benedict, right? That just means speaking well. So of course he didn't swear at his colleagues. He's called Benedict, for God's sake. I mean, that would be a terrible inference. So there has to be the proper sensitivity to data here. And this is one of the reasons why I potentially quite like this way of doing things, is it gives you a really straightforward answer to this question of when is this appropriate and when is this inappropriate. So so long as there really is a track record among Western researchers of demeaning the folk that they research by undermining their agency, then that does indeed give you some prima facie reasons to worry about particular kinds of cases. But that doesn't necessarily mean Henrik's actually done anything wrong, right? I might look at his data and I might think, do you know what? No one really has any agency. I should give up all my views about agency, because the more I read Henrik, the more I realize that not only do the Tucanalan people do things just like he does, we all do things just like he does. And it was never demeaning to withhold agency from these people, because nobody ever has agency. I mean, you can really imagine a very sort of revolutionary kind of revision here, as long as you're paying proper attention to the evidence that you're getting. The pathologies of Lysenkoism, for example, partly came from people being so concerned not to fall foul of the worries about Mendelism, Morganism, that they started cutting trees in half and sticking them together in order to show that various kinds of miraculous forms of hybridization were possible, right? So it's that kind of dogmatism. I mean, this is just a point that Anderson makes a lot. I think that's the pathology, but I'm trying to incorporate this into this direct, indirect. I think this is something, yeah. I think that.
Okay, I think it's time to stop and thank Tim again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you everyone on Zoom. I'm sorry there was a time difference that was not very clear for everyone. Sorry about that. I saw many people connecting at 6 p.m. So sorry, it's not my fault. But sorry about that. Bye everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.